Morning, everyone, and thank you very much to the organizers, the sponsors, DuPont Pioneer, Iowa State University, and special thanks to the grad student that did an amazing job at the organization and for inviting me to be here. I'm going to be, let me see if I have a pointer. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about prediction of agronomic traits using multi-time point hyperspectral crop image. And so from the introduction, you may wonder, I work in statistical genetics. So what this has to do with genetics? And it has to do with our left-hand side, which is the phenotypes. So work with phenotypes and genotypes. So the original motivation for this is actually try to integrate this IC image data as a sort of multi-dimensional phenotype, try to integrate it into breeding programs. What I'm going to talk about today is just the first step, but we plan to continue to do more research towards the integration of this type of data with genomic data. This is a joint work done mostly by a grad student, Fernando Huate from Argentina, and it was done while he was in MSU visiting us last year in collaboration with people from CIMMYT and also from Arvalis in France. So the inspection of crops is a basic tool that farmers use and agronomists use. I'm an agronomist, and so the first thing that you do is you look at the crop, and based on that you can assess vigor, potential yield, disease, etc. We can do that subjectively, or we can try to do it objectively by collecting some sort of image data from the crops, and then collecting this data and running some algorithms to predict agronomic traits. This is not a new technology. It has been around for many years for the greenhouse and also for the fields. What happened in recent years is that there have been important technological developments. First, hyperspectral cameras have become cheaper, more powerful, and lighter. And we can also mount these cameras into drones. And I say we have never done this, so I work with the data. I just want to clarify that. But people can do that and fly over very extensive areas and collect image data. And so this, of course, makes the implementation of high throughput phenotyping of very extensive areas, for instance, early testing of thousands of genotypes and high throughput phenotyping of those trials logistically and economically feasible. And this image data can potentially enable research and technology development at a different scale than the one that we are used to. However, at the same time, this speaks about the potential of the technology, but it's also true that we may need to develop efficient statistical methods to get the most out of this amazingly rich data. And this is the motivation of the study. Traditionally, image data has been summarized using vegetation indices. And this has been around for many decades already, where you take information from reflectance at a few bands, maybe in the visible light and near infrared spectrum, and then compose a vegetation index. The most widely used is the NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, but there is a plethora of indices that people have developed trying to predict not only greenness, but also water content, total mass, etc. Now, these indices usually take information from 2-3 bands from the spectrum. But the hyperspectral cameras that we have access to produce much more information, potentially hundreds of reflectance at hundreds of bands or more. And so, arguably, the information contained by these images is much richer than what can be summarized in a simple index based on 2 or 3 bands. So that leads to the first research question that we have is, can we improve our ability to predict agronomic traits using whole spectrum data, hundreds of bands? And this actually is motivated from a similar problem in genetics. In genetics, we have SNPs, for instance, hundreds of thousands, and over many years, we were trying to tackle the problem of prediction of breeding values using genotype and a few QTLs, but all the time when the technology was ready, we moved into genomic selection, using all the information together. So this study that I'm going to present somehow is motivated by the same idea. There is much more information in the data that we can probably use to if we use all the information that we have available and not a few predictors pre-selected. There is another dimension, which is the time dimension. Image data can be collected at different stages in the development of the crop. Usually once there is good coverage, or maybe in these phases, and arguably information collected at different phases can be informative about different components of yield and different aspects of the physiology of the crop. So that leads to the second research question that we have is, can we improve prediction of agronomic traits by integrating multi-time point data? So instead of having just one image, have longitudinal data on an image from a crop. So these are the main 2 points that we try to address. And so that those are the goals. And we also have a third goal that is generated mostly by the type of data we have access to. We'll see in a minute. We were working with heat data collected in heat and drought stress trials carried out in Obregon by CIMMYT. But we also have access to data from an irrigated trial. So we also try to assess whether the equation that we fit or calibrate under one set of environmental conditions, heat and drought stress, can also be predicted in a very different environmental setting, such as an irrigated trial. So the data, as I said, was from CIMMYT. It was collected in the summer of 2014 in Obregon. It's an area that is very warm in the summer and very little rain, so it's very good for doing trials under heat and drought stress. But of course, you irrigate, you can have an environment where there is no limitation in terms of availability of water. We had 12 trials. 11 were under drought and heat stress, and one, a little bit larger than the other, was irrigated. We are going to focus on the drought and stress trials, but at the end we are going to present also prediction across environments. The genotypes were 465 pre-commercial and research hybrids, so relatively diverse genotypic background, and we had a total of 1,200 records, and in the heat and drought stress about 1,000 records. So each hybrid had in the heat and drought stress a little bit more than 2 records. So it was representing more than one trial. The trait that we're going to focus is grain yield, and the image data was collected 55, the first pictures were taken 55 days after sowing, and then after that, weekly for 5 time points. And the people that pre-processed the image provided us 62 reflectance at 62 bands for every picture, which were a summary of the data collected between 400 to 855 nanometers. So it includes the visual spectrum and also beyond that. So what about the models? If we think of single type models, the data we have, it looks like this. We have a vector of phenotypes. In this case, for the heat and drought stress will be 1,000 phenotypes. And then we have a reflectance at 62 bands. And this is arbitrary numbers that I put there. So the baseline models that we consider were just simple linear regression based on vegetation indices. So we take bands from this data and compute the vegetation index, and then we relate the phenotype with the vegetation index. So we consider 2, 4, 6 different vegetation indices, the traditional NDVI, and others that have been published and have been linked to either yield, chlorophyll content, or water, total water or efficiency of water use. We also consider partial least square regression, which is a method that is commonly used. In this case, the partial least square, what it will do is it will take the phenotypes and the bands here, and will derive a set of orthogonal vectors. We call it here the latent variables. You can think of these as principal components, although they are derived in a slightly different way. They are derived to maximize the correlation with the phenotype. And then once you have these orthogonal vectors, you do a linear regression of the phenotype on the orthogonal vectors. And always the question, PLS is a dimension reduction technique. We don't use all the, the rank of the matrix. So how many components? We try from 1 to 50. So the rank here is 62. And we choose the optimal number of latent variables based on an internal validation. So whenever we are training the model, we have a training data set, we separate a calibration set, run the model with 1 to up to 50 PLS, evaluate prediction accuracy in the calibration set, pick the optimal number of components, and then refit the model in the whole training set with that optimal number and use it to predict in a testing set. All right? So that's a traditional procedure for PLS. And finally, we say, well, what if we throw all the bands together as they come into a Bayesian regression model that has been commonly used, for instance, for genomic prediction, and we use here a model that's called BaseB. And the idea here is to have a model that can do shrinkage and variable selection at the individual bands and not selecting latent variables, orthogonal vectors. It turns out that if some individual bands are more predictive, this model has some potential to perform a little bit better. That was at least our hypothesis. And I want to emphasize that although we use this model, you can probably obtain similar results if you use, for instance, an elastic net. So the idea is to use a model that can induce shrinkage and variable selection at the level of individual bands, as opposed to orthogonal vectors. So just a word about these Bayesian models. These are commonly used in genomic prediction. So you have a linear regression model where P here is the number of predictors. And typically this number of predictors is large relative to sample size. In this case, it could be, we are using 5 time points, it could be up to 300 predictors, so it's not a ultra high dimensional. And if we want to estimate all these effects with relatively limited sample size, we should use some sort of informative prior to induce shrinkage and potentially variable selection. And the one that we are using here in BaseB is a prior on the distribution of effects that includes a point of mass at 0 and a slab here. So this will induce variable selection, and this will induce a little bit of shrinkage of the estimates of the bands that enter into the model. But again, as I said, there is nothing magical about these particular models. You can probably obtain similar results if you use penalized regressions, such as the elastic net. I wouldn't use the lasso here because the predictors are highly correlated. So this is for the time point model. So we have the indices, partial least square, and the regression on all the bands. We also consider multi-time point models. So now, instead of having phenotype and just one time point, we have 5 of those matrices. So we did something that was very simple and obvious to us. First, consider single time point model where we use just data from one time point. And then we consider, okay, it turns out that, and we'll see that this time point was the most predictive one, the one that predicted data better. So we say, well, what if we supplement this time point with time point 4, or with time point 4 and time point 3, and so that way we combine data back. At that time, it was an obvious way to do it. Now that I see it, actually, I also would like to do it the other way around. Start with time point 1 and then time point 2, because that way will allow us to see how early in the crop, in the cycle, we can obtain, good prediction. This is not what this type of design will answer. So this will answer basically, if you have data at time point 5, do we have any benefit of collecting earlier data? It's a different question. So this is about the software. We also did ordinary least squares with all the bands. That was based on LM in R. The PLS was done with the PLS R package, and the Bayesian regression model was fitted using a package that we have developed for genomic prediction, which, if you have interest, is available in GitHub, and you can install it, and you have examples there. So the other point was how to assess prediction accuracy. And so the idea is, okay, we are going to calibrate equations, and we are going to use these equations to predict data in a future trial, right? So for that reason, what we did is to design a Lee-1 trial out cross-validation. Instead of removing proportions of the data, we remove entire trials. That leads to a prediction problem that is much harder than if you remove, a few entries of the data in a cross-validation, if you do a traditional cross-validation. So what we did was to remove one trial at a time. So this is the graphical representation. So we have 11 trials, so we have 11 faults. For fault 1, we remove data from trial 1. And that's our testing set. We fitted all the models using these 10 trials and then predicted in the first trial. And the same was done for every trial. So we call that the Lee-1 trial out cross-validation. We also, at the end, fitted the models using the 11 trials and used the resulting equation to predict yield in the irrigated trial. All right. Some results. These are box plots of yield. Here in tons per hectare by trial. So these are the heat and drought stress trials. And this is the irrigated trial. So we have yields that range for the heat and drought stress from 1.5 to 3.5 or 4 tons. And the irrigated trial, as expected, higher yield and a little bit more of variability, which if you look at from the point of view of coefficient of variation, is not, it's larger variance, but also larger mean. Then we look at the correlations among the 62 bands. And this heat plot basically gives you the correlation here. White will be a correlation of 1. So this is a correlation matrix. Ordered the other way that I'm used to, but for some reason, usually we have the ones in the diagonal like this, but when you do the heat map, just flip it for some reason. I guess that's the innovation that computer scientists have to bring. So so this high correlation that you see here, of course, is within the visible spectrum. So we see two clear clusters, high correlation within the visible spectrum, high correlation beyond the visible spectrum, starting the infrared, and here low correlation between the two groups. And when you look at the principal components, it's rather striking because of this strong clustering. The first two principal eigenvalues explain close to 90% of the sum of the total eigenvalues. When you look at this, you will see, well, principal component regression. Let's extract 5 principal components, or maybe even 3, and use them. Actually, we did it, and it doesn't work as well as selecting individual bands using a shrinkage and variable selection method. And you will see the PLS, which is also based on a similar idea, didn't perform as well. And the reason is that these patterns vary over trials a little bit. So when you look at the whole data, you see a clear pattern, but when you move to another trial, the pattern is slightly different at the level of principal components. So some results, prediction accuracy. What we have here is the prediction correlation in Lee-1 trial out for each of the indices, and also for the ordinary least squares with 62 bands, PLS, and Bayesian regression. So we see, and this is for 10.5 within the heat and drought stress. So we see correlation ranging from 0.3 to 0.41. So moderate correlation in all cases is slightly better for the model base B. But we also have indices at 10.5 that perform relatively well. We did a bootstrap analysis of the cross-validation predictions and counted how many times one model, this number I should say, when you do a Lee-1 trial out cross-validation, you have a correlation for every trial. So you have 11 estimates per method. So this is a weighted average, right? Traditional weighted average where the weight was the inverse of the variance of the correlation, the sampling variance of the correlation. So this is based on 11 correlations actually. So when you do the bootstrap, this estimator that is based on 11 correlations and a total of 1,000 points, yes, it's significantly different than this one, but the magnitude is not something to, it's not very, very large. What happened when we move to time point 4? We see the correlations goes down a little bit. Mostly some correlation from indices go down, and the method using all the bands and including the ordinary squares, they go down, but by a lesser, still we get a correlation of 0.37. And when you move to data from time point 3, you see the same pattern. As you move far back, the indices start to lose prediction predictive ability, and these models also lose predictive ability, but not as much as the indices. This is the figure for time point 2. So similar conclusions, and for time point 1, where we end up with even some indices having, like the NDVI, negative correlation with yield. So this is a summary of what we observed. What we have here is the average correlation for individual time point data for a selected methods, base B based on all the bands, ordinary least square, PLS, and the 2. Well, this was one of the best performing indices. At least we put it as a reference because it's commonly used, the NDVI. So what we see here is that as we move from time point 1 to time point 5, correlations increase. In the case of base B, only a little bit. In the case of some indices here, like the NDVI, quite a lot. At time point 5, we see modest differences between methods. But if we go to early time points, we see much. So overall, this method was the best performing one, but also was more stable. And the reason why it's more stable is because it's based on information from a lot of bands, many bands, and not just one or two, where you can have a measurement error, and that can give a lot of volatility to or variability to the correlation between reflectance those bands and yield. What about multi-time point models? So we have here the results that we obtain when we use only data from time point 5. And what we have here is when we supplemented this data with time point 4, time point 3, 4, and 5, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and T1 to T5. So these results are based on models that use data from the 5 time points. And we see overall a small increase, and this, in the case of base B, we see an increase from 0.4 to probably 0.47 in correlation. Still, base B was the best performing method. And for the indices in particular, supplementing data from multi-time point was, had an important impact. The only one that behaves different is ordinary least squares. And I'll tell you a story. I didn't plan to use ordinary least square, but the grad student came, and the first thing that he did, because that was what he knew to do, was ordinary least squares. And it turns out that when you look at a single time point, although we are estimating 62 regression coefficients, OLS doesn't perform that bad. But of course, when you move from 62 regression coefficients to 300 and something, the ordinary least square, I still was surprised how good the ordinary least square performed. But if you are planning to use a lot of bands, of course you need to use some shrinkage or variable selection method to do that. And you can see here, ordinary least square doesn't benefit from the additional information because it adds a lot of sampling variance to the estimate, because we are estimating a lot of coefficients with a final sample. What about across environment prediction? So what we are going to see now is we got the data from the 11 heat and drought stress trials, fit the equations, and use them to predict in the irrigated trial. So this is a very challenging situation because, first of all, in the irrigated trial, everything is green, right? So that makes the correlation between these indices, especially the NDVI, with yield very poor because it's very difficult to discriminate things that look very similar. On the other hand, in the heat and drought stress, you have genotypes that are more tolerant and cover the soil better, and so the image data has more power to predict under those conditions than under optimal conditions. So here we have the results for the within environments of heat and drought stress, training the model in heat and drought stress and predicting left out trials in the heat and drought stress. We saw these results already for time point 5. What happened when we try to predict across environment under irrigation? Most of the indices, they drop the correlation a lot. essentially the MDVI is not correlated with yield if everything is green, right? And that makes at least sense to me. But we saw that these two methods that use individual bands, all the bands, ordinary least square and base B, they gave lower correlation, but were, you know, considerably better than the other methods. When we move to time point 4, the same picture. So these are the results within environment and these are cross environment. We now see a couple of indices, especially this one, that perform well. But overall, these methods that are using all the bands seem to either be the best methods or perform close to the best method. And we can do the same, but I'm not going to bore you with you know, all the time points. Let me go to the multi-time point model. So this is the case where we integrate the data from time 1 to time 5, fitted the equations to the heat and drought stress trials, and use them to predict in the irrigated trial. And so that's what we see. Again, the ordinary least square and base B, based on all the individual bands, perform considerably better than the indices and even better than the partial least square method in this case. So these are a summary of the results. Let me give a couple of remarks. We see that using data from individual bands and all the bands together gave higher prediction accuracy than single vegetation indices. So it seems that there is much more information. It's clear, but you know, this shows that there is much more information in hyperspectral image data than what we can summarize in traditional vegetation indices. Among the model tested, base B had the best performance, but again, I want to emphasize that it's not base B per se, it's just doing shrinkage and variable selection at the individual bands and using all of them seems to be a good approach in this case. So we use base B, but perhaps you can get similar results using methods such as the elastic net, for instance. Most of the indices had somewhat, somehow erratic behavior. So in some trials or time points, they perform well, but not in others. While what we saw that if we use all the bands, we always obtain either the best performing method or something that is, you know, 1 or 2 points below the best performing methods. And the other methods, sometimes they do slightly better, like in the cross environment prediction, we saw for one time point that one index was very good, but in other cases, they do not do very well. So it seems that using all the bands also gives you some sort of robustness or stability across time points and conditions. And finally, combining multi-time point data seems to improve prediction accuracy, and this was particularly evident for the indices, which are the ones that are more variable or, you know, also probably more subject to measurement error. So it makes sense that combining data from multiple time points for the indices improves performance. We were surprised that the PLS did not perform as well as one would think if one considers that PLS has been used extensively for this type of problems. And why is that? We think that the main reason is that actually, and we also see this in genetics, if you do principal component regression or PLS, you don't do as well as if you do models that select or shrink differentially the effects of different SNPs. So we sort of had the feeling that doing the shrinkage and variable selection at the level of the original inputs, in this case the bands, is more effective than selecting linear combination of all the bands and then selecting the number of linear combinations, which is what PLS or principal component regression will do. Some feature research. These equations were equations for prediction of yield. We were motivated for genetic problems. So we would like to calibrate this equation for breeding purposes. So imagine that you are testing in early generation testing thousands of genotypes. It's logistically difficult. The more genotypes we can test, the more selection intensity we can have and genetic progress. So the potential for this technology is that we can increase, make it feasible to test thousands of genotypes and select, you know, a number to be advanced to the next steps. And so we can think that maybe with images we can identify the 25% or 20% of the plots that are more promising, and then go and deeply phenotype these plots and not all the plots. And that will be one approach where this technology can be incorporated into breeding. But of course, in that case, we don't want to predict yield. We want to predict genetic values or the genetic component of it. We don't want to just identify, the plot that had more fertility. We want to identify the best genotypes. The equation that we fit are predictive of yields. We want to calibrate them to predict genetic values, and for that we need to estimate genetic correlations between these prediction equations and yield, and that's something that we plan to do. And of course, we have a study that was published a couple of years ago in the Journal of Crop Improvement, where we show that the genetic correlation between yield and NDVI in some trials is very high, in other trials is very low. There is sampling variability, of course, on those estimates, but it suggests that it may not be very good for selection purposes. And so we want to improve that, and the idea is, can we get higher genetic correlations using whole spectrum data? And doing that, of course, will require modeling not only the spectrum data, but also the experimental design, the environmental factors, all together, so that we can somehow separate the genetic and the environmental component, and that's something that we are planning to do. Also, if you are interested in this area of research, I think that there is potential here to test some nonlinear methods such as neural networks, that now has been relabeled as deep learning, but it's a neural network. They are usually very effective for image data, so there may be opportunities here to move beyond the linear models that we just discussed. All right, so this is what I have. I would like to finish by acknowledging again the research team, especially Fernando, who was involved in all this analysis, and all the collaborators from CIMMYT and from Arvalisc, and the funding that was provided by CIMMYT, Michigan State University, and Arvalisc. With that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be glad if we have time to take any questions that you may have. Thanks.
Tom, my question is, you have multiple time points, and compare with the prediction accuracy in time point T2 to T5 is higher than the time point T1 to T5. Maybe someone think about it's error or it's coincidence, but I don't think it is. I think it should be higher than the T1 to T5. It is because in the development of the plants, sometimes in the early stage, some QTL effect is different from the final stage. So some QTL function will disappear, or some another will show up. So I don't think we should. Sometimes we think the statistics more data is more valuable. We should use all of the data, but I don't think here we should use T1 because T1 is far from T5. So how do you think about this multiple time?
Yeah, so thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question. So there are always trade-offs here. If we know the mechanistics of this, if we know that this, for instance, we go to genetics, that these are the genes that affect trait, yield, of course, we should use information from those. But it turns out that we don't know, right? And the only one that we know, and I'm talking about the genetic problem, usually explain very little of the total genetic variance. So there is a trade-off. If we can reduce the dimensions and go to what is useful, that is great. But sometimes it turns out that we don't know that. And what these statistical models try to do is to infer that directly from data. So when we put data from all the time points, what we let is the algorithm to discover that. There are algorithms that are very poor at doing that. And one example of that is ordinary least squares. If you throw a lot of things to ordinary least squares, you introduce a lot of sampling variance, and that is not a very good algorithm. But it turns out that if you use shrinkage and variable selection combined with regularized methods such as base B, and I will insist it's not just base B, there are many methods, this algorithm tends to perform well from the point of view of prediction. All right, what is my interpretation here? Why are we obtaining better results, or slightly better, using time point 1 to 5 as opposed to just time point 5? I think that has to do with measurement error as well. This image data that we collect are subject to a lot of measurement error. They rely on sun exposure. For instance, in one time point here, there was a rain, a small rain. that happened. That was what people told me, and that affected the quality of the data. And sometimes by averaging data over, that is, if you have data subject to measurement error, and you take averages, and that happens when you take a test, and if the test is not good, they run it twice, and they take the average. That is done to reduce the measurement error, and that's maybe something that may be going on here.
And then you might have multiple time points that produce multiple trials. And the development stage, I guess, may vary among these trials. So right now, we're using the time point as a planning to anchor, like say, the first one assumed at the same development stage. I don't know if like we can consider like synchronize the different development stage among trials. Will it improve the accuracy?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So in this case, things are relatively well, actually, I don't know how well synchronized. They are well synchronized from the point of view of environmental conditions, which are very homogeneous, semi-air, very controlled environment, you know. But there is diversity on the hybrids. And I wouldn't say diversity between travelers. Mostly what I would expect is differences in developmental stages within trial between hybrids. And I don't know the extent of that. So ideally, yes, we would like to refer these time points to specific physiological stages. In this case, all trials were planned at the same time. First measurement done 55 days after sowing, and then 1 week after that. We should expect that the average developmental stage across trials is similar because it's a relatively controlled environment, but it's differences between hybrids. Yeah, so I think there is room to improve on that. I'm not sure how to do it in this case because we cannot take a picture of every, you know, it will require taking pictures of every plot within a trial because most of the variability will be within a trial. Yes.
Okay, so I have two questions. One is just curious why you are using the coefficient of correlation to measure the performance instead of miscalculation error or the coefficient of variation. To see how accurate they are in terms of prediction. Second question is that what's the unit that you do the regression? I suppose it's the plot, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can measure the yield, and then you have an image for the whole plot.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have multiple measurements. Did you just average them, or what do you use to summarize?
Two very important questions. So why we use correlation? We were considering mostly this from the point of view of breeding and how well, you know, this method could rank the different hybrids in this case, and not concerned about mean differences. So that's the reason why we use the correlation, but you can use other metrics. In genetics, we tend to use the correlation because we are interested in rankings. And although the Spearman, you know, the Pearson correlation is not exactly a rank correlation, it gives you a good idea of the rankings. And so if you are shifted by 1 or 2 units, all the predictions, we are not concerned about that, usually. To your second point, that is correct. So we have multiple pixels. So the unit was the plot. So each plot we have an yield measurement and a picture, and the picture we have multiple pixels. I was not involved in the pre-processing, but this is what they told me they did. They removed the border pixel, they selected a number, I don't remember on top of my head how many pixels, from the center of the plot, and then they derive reflectance at each of these units, and then what we are using is the average across a number of pixels. But I'm wondering whether there are opportunities to further improve prediction accuracy using something else other than the average pixel within an area. It's great to be an audience that is interested in the topic.
Genotypes. There could be different susceptible.
Say that again.
The first is different genotypes. There could be different susceptible genotypes as well. You can see the difference in the trials between the irrigated and the difference.
You're talking about re-ranking of the hybrids in irrigation and GYE type?
Yeah, the susceptible conditions.
Susceptibility. I must say that I cannot answer the question because I don't know about, I didn't have access to any disease data. That could be the case. you know, it's clear that disease will have an impact on both image and yield. So to what extent these predictions that we are obtaining are actually being predictive of yield due to prediction of, you know, disease, for instance, I cannot answer. Yeah, I don't have a data on that, but it's an important point, yes.
Thank you for the great presentation. I have a question about the models. I noticed you used both ordinary least square, half least square, and base B. And if I interpreted the figure correctly, I noticed that the half least square generated better correlation with base B than the ordinary least square. So
not always. So let's look at this one actually. So for instance, here is ordinary least squares, here is base B, and here is PLS. So it's actually not doing better than the ordinary least squares in this case.
Okay, so I'm not that familiar with the difference between half least square and ordinary least square. So can you explain a little bit more?
Yeah. So in ordinary least squares, you use all the bands, in this case, the 62 bands, and you obtain your beta hat, your estimated effects for each band in particular by minimizing the residual sum of squares. So by deriving the linear equation that will fit your training data best. That is a very good and powerful method. However, you need to estimate a lot of coefficients. Sometimes tends to overfit, it has a lot of sampling variance and doesn't predict as well. So it's not a method that I would recommend if you need to estimate a lot of coefficients. The partial least square is a dimension reduction technique. So you will take linear combinations of all bands, one linear combination, which one? The one that maximizes the correlation with Y, with your yield. And then once you derive that, you derive a second linear combination that is orthogonal to the first one and maximizes the correlation with the remaining residual. So it's and then you use, you know, in this case, this for single time point models, the matrix have rank of 62 or maybe 61 or 60. I didn't check, but it should be of the order of 60. But we don't use 60 latent variable. We end up using, depending on the result, between 10 to 15 components. I guess that's, I hope it's a nice explanation of PLS. I'm not an expert on PLS, but I hope it is.